Okay, today we're going to start chapter 12, a little bit more about Rome. 12:1 is about the Roman way of life. So first of all, we should say that Rome is the center of the empire, right? The city is one of the largest cities in the ancient world. It is a planned out city with square main streets. It's basically a big square. And the streets are all crossing at right angles. If you picture it, the emperor is living in a palace up on top of the hill, and at the base of the hill, there's a large open space called a forum, which is like the marketplace and public square. So very kind of similar thinking to like the Greeks, right? And around the forum is all the temples and other public buildings, okay? The wealthy are going to also live on hills in the city in very nice houses with marble walls, tile floors, running water. They usually, if you look at the picture, had a courtyard in the center, which they called the atrium, and all the sunlight came down, and often there would be a garden in the middle there. And they also, because they're wealthy, have an additional home out in the farms in the country, and they were called villas. If you are, poor, so the majority are poor, right? There were some in between, like the artisans and everything, but most are poor. The poor, remember, this is a hard time, right, where people are out of work or getting paid very low, if you remember. And so they live in really crowded, noisy, dirty neighborhoods. They usually live in wooden apartments, 6 or 7 stories tall, and they would often collapse, or of course, since they're wood, they'd catch on fire. So it was really dangerous. Also, it's they would just throw the garbage out into the streets. So imagine, right, it's dirty. That's going to bring vermin. There's also a lot of thieves and problems, just like, today in bad parts of the cities, it's the same problem, right? And we mentioned before about how the leaders know that the poor are unhappy of all these situations, so they are doing the bread and circuses. So we mentioned that before. So just a reminder, the ones that we mentioned was that there was a big amphitheater called the Circus Maximus, which was like a huge oval, and they had things like chariot racing in that first picture going around there. And then there's another famous building called the Colosseum, which is a little more circular. And the Colosseum was where they usually had like the gladiator fighting as the most famous thing. And the gladiators would either fight each other to the death, or animals like lions and things would be put in there. And, they would purposely not feed the animals, so they were hungry and, more willing to attack. And the people that are usually in that situation were usually people in dire straits, right? So slaves, criminals, prisoners of war. If you're really poor, you could actually end up doing pretty well. It was very popular, and that people really liked the gladiators and looked up to the ones that were able to do well. So some of them actually kind of made a name for themselves. As far as family life, it's similar to other times we've talked about, where early on they had really large families, and the fathers, of course, would control the family. If you're married, you'd often live with your parents still in that same house. So you had larger families living together. The father would watch over the wife and what she's doing and really kind of control. They even legally had control. Like I put this example of, if they wanted to, they could sell their children into slavery or even put them to death. And their wives, of course, also didn't have a lot of rights early on. Later, things start to get a little better for women. They get some rights, and you do see that the families are starting to have some fewer children, and they have a little more divorce and remarrying and things happening. Okay, so the fathers are responsible for education. So if you are a boy and you are wealthy, then you will have, private lessons at home. And then as they get older, they would go to schools, right? Go away to schools, and they'd study reading, writing, arithmetic, and rhetoric, which is public speaking. If you're a wealthy older girl, you would still stay home, though. You wouldn't be off. And remember, what you study is not going to be the same because they don't think you need to be really smart girls. So the boys, let's stick with the boys for right now. The boys, when you turn 15, you are considered an adult. So you'd burn your toys as offerings to the gods. And then you would put on the white toga that marks you as a man. And once you're an adult, then you'd work for your family's business, or maybe you'd get a job in the government or join the army. And men usually got married later, but women got married young, like around 14. So girls, like I said, if you're wealthy, you would get to do some studying at home and get married around 14. And of course, the things you're going to study are going to be things, right, like not the hard sciences or anything, right, like fashion, literature, art, right? Things that are just to make you beautiful and accomplished, but not, worrying too much about you being that smart. Women did not have full citizen rights, right? And in fact, very many rights at all. They're kind of up to what their husband said. Although there's a lot of stories about privately how, right, their husbands might listen kind of if they had advice, or they could kind of get some things. If you are wealthy, you of course have more freedom than if you are not. Some wealthy women even owned property and could run a business and own land for themselves, things like that. They didn't have to do any hard labor, right, because they had all the slaves. So they could just like run the household and do the fun things of like art and literature. If they did go out and wanted to go to the theater, for example, they had to sit separately. Men all sat together and women all sat together. So that was the norm for the time. All right. If you were poor, or if you, like, for instance, if you are a prisoner of war, you are a slave. And we had mentioned that before, that the slavery has increased quite a bit as Rome goes and conquers other places and it gets more territory. So at this point, just to give you an idea, around 100 BC, we're up to about 40% of Italy is made up of slaves. So it's a very high slave population. And, what you did would depend on your skills. You could do hard labor things like harvesting the crops or mining ore or building roads and all the other different building projects. Or if you were, especially if you're Greek, if you were educated, then they may have you be a teacher or a doctor, things like whatever your skill is. So not everyone was hard labor, but no matter who you were, right, you didn't have any rights. And if you could be whipped and treated very harshly if you didn't do a good job, right, because you're still a slave. And often they would, right, not often, but sometimes they would try to rebel or run away and things like that. Spartacus is probably the most famous example of this. You've probably heard of him because of the movies. He was a gladiator who got very popular, and he ended up leading a slave rebellion in 73 BC. It does not go well, unfortunately. His plan was to lead his followers. He had a big following, up to like about 70,000. And he thought that we would fight our way and we'll get to the Alps and then everyone can go home to their other, wherever they're from. But of course, the army is not going to put up with this huge of a slave revolt, and they crush them. Spartacus is killed in battle, and about 6,000 of his followers are crucified. And if you don't know what crucifixion is, that's when you are nailed up on a cross, right? And so you're still alive, but you die slowly and painfully. usually from suffocating. We can talk about that more when we talk about Christianity, right? That's what happened to Jesus. So this was crucifixion. Sometimes kids think crucifixion is like only thing they did to Jesus. No, that was actually a popular, if you want to call it, thing they did to criminals and people that were against the empire. All right, religion. The Romans admired the Greeks in a lot of different ways, and one of them is their religion. They basically just slapped on Roman names for the gods, right? So, for example, Zeus is now Jupiter, and Aphrodite is now called Venus, but they pretty much just copied their gods. And you can see also that religion is kind of taking a form where, starting with Augustus, they made the emperor is now considered a god officially by the Senate. So that's an interesting change, right? And so Roman gods were thought to influence all parts of your life. It was very important to make the gods happy, so they would give a lot of offerings. They would have public temples, and also you would have one in your home, an altar in your home, and you'd offer incense or food, whatever you're eating for dinner, or honey was a treat. And also, like I said, public temples were there too. They also changed Greek philosophy a bit. Stoicism was one of the ones that, if you remember Stoicism, they changed it a little bit to say it meant like you should live a practical life, like do your duty, be active in Roman government, and treat the conquered people well. So it's a little slight change of Stoicism instead of it being on reason, right? But overall, they did treat people well in the sense that they let them have freedom of religion. All right. Again, lots of things from the Greeks. So science. There's a Greek doctor that the Romans learned a lot from. His name was Galen, and he was mostly the big thing we got from him was from the study of anatomy. He wanted to learn about the inner organs, and so he cut open dead animals and recorded his findings. And so actually that was really helpful for doctors, and his work has been studied for, over 1,000 years. Also, the Ptolemy, you might have heard of Ptolemy before, is a famous scientist. And he was an astronomer. He lived in Alexandria, which, remember, is a city of learning in Egypt. And he studied the sky and mapped it really carefully with over 1,000 stars and the motions of the planets. And that really, again, was something that people studied for centuries. So he was a big influence. We already mentioned that Rome engineering was quite impressive. And here's a few examples, right? We talked about the aqueducts the other day. Also, they did a really great job with their road system, which I mentioned the other day. It was called the Appian Way. I'm not sure if I told you that was called that. There was connection of roads, and it went all the way throughout Rome to connect, right? We talked about helping for soldiers to move quickly, and of course for trade. And so we already talked about the aqueducts the other day and they're important for bringing water into the city, right? And another thing is Roman numerals, which is actually a system that's based on Greeks and Etruscan work. And we know that those were used for a really long time. In fact, today you can still see them around. Probably you only think of it like Super Bowl games, right? But they are around. Okay, and then art and architecture. So in arts, one of the big things you'll see is that the Roman statues are more realistic than the Greeks. So they allowed... remember, the Greeks wanted to make everything looking perfect, and that was really important to them, while the Romans were okay with wrinkles and warts and things that are less attractive. Also in the architecture, they took a lot of Greek ideas and then they kind of built on it. So for instance, they used arches, and you see them a lot in Roman architecture, bridges and aqueducts and buildings. And then if you put rows of arches together, you can form something called a vault, a vaulted ceiling. Have you ever heard of that? It's kind of a curved ceiling. And so I put in a picture there so you can see what a barrel vault, so you can understand the progression that they're going to build on that, and they're going to figure out how to make domes. So if you see domes, you know it's starting with Roman architecture and past that time, because Greeks didn't use domes. And then the big thing that they were smart about is they mastered concrete. They were able to make a better mixing volcanic ash, lime, and water. And when you make that, it's really hard, right? Like rock, it's better quality, and that's why a lot of their buildings survive longer than other ones. There's some examples. The Pantheon is one of the most famous examples. It has the largest dome that they had made at the time, and it's the reason it's mostly famous also is because it's still around, right? It's undamaged. It's one of the oldest buildings we have today. All right, literature. Again, they're taking very much like the Greeks. Their writing was like the Greeks, except for they kind of added their own twist. For instance, they would honor their gods, but they would also write comedies about them. Or they'd praise their military successes, but then they'll also write about their failures. So it's a little bit, again, not that like perfection that the Greeks had. In their plays, they had a moral ending like the Greeks did, but then they also added in some reality. So like sometimes the characters, things didn't go well for them. So that was okay with the Romans. More human side things. And they're not afraid to poke fun at their leaders. Okay. There's a few that we've talked about in the past, right? Virgil, we mentioned earlier. He wrote the epic poem, the Aeneid. Remember the founding of Rome. He got his ideas, and very similar. We mentioned when we talked about it from Greeks. Homer's Odyssey, right? So you can see that influence from Greek literature. Also, the Roman poet Horace is famous for writing satires. He wrote two different kinds of things. Satires, which is, again, that poking fun at human weaknesses. Pretty much, right? We like satire today a lot, right? Like comedians. And then odes. You've probably heard of ode to whatever. Well, an ode, if you don't know, is a poem that expresses strong emotion about your life, right? And so Horace is one of the famous writers from the Romans. And then historians, again, they took the ideas of the Greek historians and this time, remember Herodotus, and it was like a big change that they were actually writing and trying to get proof and like have, kind of research done. Well, in this one, Livy is one of the famous ones. And in Livy, he thought that history teaches moral lessons. So he had that focus about what, why you should study history. He also talked about how great Rome was, but he also wanted to kind of talk about lessons. Tacitus was a little bit more critical. He thought that the Romans were losing their values that made them awesome and strong, and he thought they were wasting their time on sports and pleasure activities. And so he was pretty critical. All right, theater was a really big thing in Rome. Plays would be often put on in religious celebrations or national festivals. Men or boys were the ones who did the acting, and they wore masks so that they could change characters pretty quickly, right, and show who was on stage. And women eventually got a little bit. They only were allowed to be in comedies that were called mimes, which is interesting that you might have that idea of a mime came from having women in there. And then the last thing that we often talk about is language. So the language of the Romans, of course, is Latin. And it becomes, with the empire getting so large, it is also going to become a very influential language. We know that it became the language of trade and learning and running governments in Europe for a really long time, till like 1500 AD. And it's also the basis for a lot of our modern languages. Italian, French, Spanish are based on it. And also, we have a lot of words in our English language that are still based in Latin.